Vengeful ghosts and curses. Throughout history, man has governed his life according to certain laws and principles. A consensus natural order evolved over the centuries. Those caught defying that order face the consequences of human justice. Sometimes, though, justice is not seen to be done. Criminals go unpunished. Murders remain unsolved. But do the undetected guilty parties really ever get away with it? Or do eerie, inexplicable forces intervene to restore the balance in matters of life and death? The Mummy's Hand. Count Louis Hammond was famed as an occultist and psychic healer. He was often given exotic presents by grateful clients he had cured. But the oddest gift of all brought him nothing but trouble. On a visit to Luxor in 1890, Hammond cured a prominent sheik of malaria. The sheik insisted that the healer accept a gruesome gift, the mummified right hand of a long-dead Egyptian princess. Count Hammond's wife disliked the dry, shriveled hand from the first. But her dislike turned to horror and revulsion when she heard the story behind it. In the 17th and last year of his reign, King Akhenaten of Egypt, the heretical father-in-law of Tutankhamun, quarreled over religious matters with his daughter, and the king's vengeance was ghastly. In 1357 BC, he had the girl raped and murdered by his priests. Afterwards, they cut off her right hand and buried it secretly in the Valley of the Kings. People of Egypt were appalled, for the girl would be barred from paradise because her body was not intact at burial. Hammond would have turned the relic over to a museum, but he could not find a curator willing to accept it. He locked it away in an empty safe in the wall of his London home. In October 1922, he and his wife reopened the safe and stood back in horror. The murdered girl's hand had changed. Shriveled and mummified for 3,200 years, it began to soften with new flesh. The accountant screamed that it must be destroyed. Although he'd never before been afraid of the unknown, Hammond agreed with her. He insisted on only one thing, that the hand of the princess must have the best funeral they could give it. They were ready on the night of October 31st, 1922, Halloween. In a letter to his lifelong friend, the archaeologist Lord Carnarvon, Hammond wrote that he had laid the hand gently in the fireplace and read aloud a passage from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. As he closed the book, there was a blast of thunder that rocked the house into total darkness. The door flew open with a sudden wind. Hammond and his wife fell to the floor and lay there in the sudden glacial cold. Lifting their eyes, they saw the figure of a woman. In Hammond's account, she wore the royal apparel of old Egypt, with the serpent of the house of the pharaohs glittering on her tall headdress. The woman's right arm ended in a raw stump. The apparition bent over the fire and then was gone as suddenly as it appeared. The severed hand had vanished with it and was never seen again. 4 days later, Hammond read that Carnarvon expedition had discovered Tutankhamen's tomb and that they would enter it in spite of the ancient warning emblazoned at the threshold. From the room in the hospital where he and his wife were under treatment for a severe shock, Hammond sent his old friend a letter begging him to reconsider. He wrote, "I know now the ancient Egyptians had knowledge and power of which today we have no comprehension. In the name of God, I beg you to take care. Carnarvon ignored the letter, and soon afterwards he was dead from an infected mosquito bite. One by one, members of the expedition followed him to the grave in what became known as the Curse of the Pharohs. The Restless Skull. Collecting skulls was the private passion of a British doctor, John Kilner. He had them specially polished and encased in ebony boxes, which he displayed around his home. But the skull that fascinated him most of all was the one he did not own. It was on a skeleton at West Suffolk Hospital, where he worked in the 1870s. Part of the attraction was the skeleton's gruesome history. It was the skeleton of a murderer, 23-year-old William Corder, hanged in public at nearby Bury St. Edmunds Prison in April 1828 for the notorious Red Barn murder of Maria Martin. For years, Dr. Kilner greedily eyed the skeleton, which was used to teach students. Then one night he stole it, put it on one of the showcases in his home. Immediately his life became a nightmare. An evil spirit roamed the house, muttering and breathing heavily. Often, sobbing was heard. Eventually, a vivid white hand floated through the air and smashed the skull's showcase. The doctor was so horrified that he gave the skull to a friend, who was in turn subjected to so much similar terror that he finally gave it a Christian burial. The tormented soul of Killer Corder was at last able to rest in peace. The Witch's Mark. Scars on a persecutor's grave. The year was 1692, and 13 people had been hanged for witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts. As a matter of concern to Colonel Bucks of Bucksport, Maine, that his own village should be just as vigilant in stamping out witches. He raised the question repeatedly at town hall meetings. Shortly, his one-man crusade produced a victim. There is a public accusation of a bent and withered old lady who looked every inch a witch. Historians disagree as to her name and age, but one of them calls her Comfort Ainsworth, and she was more than 90 years old. Because of her obvious frailty, the old lady went on trial without torture or pricking with needles to find the witch's mark. But the crowds that surged into the courtroom knew her guilt had been predetermined by Colonel Bucks himself, who sat within whispering distance of the magistrate. When witnesses took the stand against her, without exception, they looked to Bucks for approval. One woman said she had heard the old woman muttering something that sounded gibberish, but when she reached home and her ears started bleeding, she knew it had to have been a curse. A man swore he'd seen a black-garbed figure 10 feet tall, obviously the devil or one of his henchmen, standing in Comfort's doorway. The jury quickly returned a verdict of guilty, quoting the text, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." The judge denounced Comfort Ainsworth and sentenced her to hang the very next day. No one was prepared for the scene that followed. Because she had not been permitted to testify in her own defense, people would assume that the toothless old woman would remain mute. Before the bailiffs could stop her, she got to her feet and pointed a bony finger at the colonel. "In all my life," she screamed, "I've cursed no other being, but I'm capable of laying a curse on you, sir, because you and your toadies have lied me to the gallows." The Mark you this and mark it well. When you go to your grave, which will be soon, I pledge you I shall leave the print of my foot on your gravestone, and the print Colonel Buck's will be there forever, so that the world can never forget this day. The bailiff clapped his palm to her mouth and carried her from the courtroom, but her words left the village uneasy, and there were few spectators when she hanged next morning. Even Colonel Bucks failed to appear. 3 months later, he died from a wasting disease, and the colonel's heirs found he had written a new instruction into his will. His headstone must be of the most flawless marble, incapable of being stained or besmirched. But in a few days, the relatives were secretly approached by a terrified cemetery worker. He had found a woman's footprint in the marble, and no amount of sanding could remove it. A new stonecutter was sworn to absolute secrecy. Working in the dead of the night, he cut a marker that was an absolute replica of the first. The old stone was buried secretly and the new one raised. 10 days later, the heir saw crowds of frightened people moving in and out of the cemetery. Joining them, they found that the trick had failed. The shape of an old woman's narrow, stockinged foot was clearly visible in the new stone. Publicly deploring the phenomenon as an act of graveyard vandalism, an explanation that convinced absolutely no one, the heirs had still more costly headstones hauled to the cemetery. It was raised with no attempt at secrecy. Incredibly, the print of Comfort's bony little foot soon began to take shape in all the stones. This time, his discouraged heirs made no effort to replace the marker. Nearly 3 centuries later, it stands over the grave of Colonel Bucks, the footprint still scarring its surface like a wound that will never heal. Thanks for sitting around and humoring an old fox and his tales. If you'd like more, please hit like and subscribe. And remember, nothing is more frightening than a fear you cannot name.